Economic spending, economic growth spending, $1 billion, economic growth spending, economic growth, economic labor,
economic dollars, $1 billion, economic growth, labor force, economic labor force, growth, spending, $1 billion, dollars, economic spending,
economic growth,
labor force, labor force, or economic labor force, growth,
spending,
discretionary spending, dollars, or economic
spending,
discretionary spending,
economic growth,
$1 billion,
labor force, economic growth,
labor force growth, labor force growth,
dollars, economic growth, labor force, economic growth, labor force, $1 billion, economic
growth, labor force,
labor force, economic,
labor growth,
discretionary spending, discretionary spending,
discretionary spending, discretionary spending,
labor force, $1 billion, spending growth,
labor dollars, spending,
$1 billion, economic growth,
spending, growth,
spending, growth, dollars,
labor force,
economic growth, discretionary spending growth,
discretionary spending, growth, spending, discretionary economic growth,
labor,
spending dollars, $1 billion,
dollars,
$1 billion, growth, spending, growth,
economic growth, economic spending, dollars, economic $1 billion,
spending, dollars, discretionary spending, economic growth, spending, economic labor force growth, economic discretionary spending, dollars, discretionary spending, $1 billion, growth for spending, growth, billion, growth.